Wow, Elementor has released a new beta version of their builder, which is the version 3.13. And they now have a new layout option for the containers, which is the CSS Grid. Wow, when I saw that this morning, I was pretty happy about that, since I'm working on a page right now, and I would have been happy to have access to CSS Grid. I tried to do that manually before using some CSS code, but the way that Elementor has many levels, let's say it like that, of divs, was making that pretty hard, to say the least. So what about CSS Grid now in Elementor? Does it work? Is it good? Does it live up to the challenge? Let's say it like that. Well, let's take a look. I have this page built with Elementor, of course, and using this new CSS Grid. Basically, when you insert a new element, a new section, a new container, you have the choice between the old Flexbox model or using the new grid model. So if I click on that, you see that I have pre-made layouts. So we have 2 columns, 2 rows, 3 columns, 3 rows, and a kind of a grid like that with 2 rows and 2 columns and 3 by 3, 3 by 2, sorry. So we can choose one of those. For example, if I use this one, so you see that we now have our elements. We only have one place to add content, but it's because we show the grid outline by default. So we just have one element inside of it right now. And of course, the container itself is empty, but we can add one element, I should say, but it still displays the grid. So you see that by default, it creates a grid outline here. Sorry, the grid outline is what we see. It transformed the content here, the container layout, to grid instead of flexbox. So basically, you can toggle from one to the other just using that drop down here. And if you go with the grid layout, you can show or not show simply a preview, if I can set it like that, or the outline of the grid itself. And by default, it will use the 3 columns and 1 row because I chose, of course, this layout when I clicked on it. But you can always change that, and you can go up to 12 columns, from 1 to 12 columns, which are, as you can see, fractions. So if you look at my other videos where I explained grids using bricks, for example, you probably know what are fractions. If not, I really encourage you to go and take a look at those videos in my channel. We also have the same thing for rows. We can have from 1 to 12 rows as well. And we have a little menu here to go from fractions to whatever content you want to type. So in that regards, grids are pretty easy to use in Elementor. So if I go back to the one that I have already created, what I did here, I'm going to get rid of that one so it's not confusing. I simply created 6 containers inside of that, and in each container we have a heading just for the number that we have here. A little bit of styling, of course, to make it stand out like that. And here we go. So now, as I said, we have 3. And by default, by the way, we have no gaps here. But like for any, like the Flexbox model for the containers, Elementor will add something like 20 pixels of gap by default. So if you want to get rid of this gap, you have to insert 0 here. Or, of course, you can put any other value as well if you want to work in pixels or if you want to work with any other units. So let's keep it at 0 right now just to show you how the grids are working. So it auto flows to the row. So that means that if we have more content, like is the case here, we have 3 columns, but we have 6 elements. So it goes automatically to the other row. That's what it means. If we say columns, it will go from column 1, column 2 to column 3 and still keep 2 rows like that. Then we can play with justification, alignment, and so on, like we can do with the Flexbox. So up to that, it's pretty cool. Now, if I go work with the responsive layout, if I toggle that, for example, to the tablet mode, stays like that, pretty cool. And if I switch to my my mobile layout here, it goes, well, that's a problem that I had. Okay, so sometimes when you move from one to the other, you will find out, by the way, that it doesn't refresh the right way. You simply have to come back and move that a little, and then suddenly it takes back the, that's probably a bug of the beta version. But by default, it was adding or changing any element that you have there, which is 3 in my case, to 1, so that we can see it the right way, right, like that. So what you saw previously, don't think about that. That's simply because I had made some little tests by adding my own element. So works perfectly fine in this regard. Now, if I go back here, I can change, like I said, the fractions to be anything else. So if I want to play with that, and fractions work that way, by the way, you specify one fraction, like that, sorry, no space. You specify one fraction or a unit of measure, or the number of elements, I should say it like that, will specify the number of columns that you want. So if I want to have 4 columns, I would have to specify one FR 4 times. And that means that they have all the same size, one fraction for each. So 4 fractions, because I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Then that means simply that each one of them will have a quarter of for the size. Now, if I remove one, then we have 3 columns. Now, what if I wanted to have one bigger than the others? Well, what I can do is specify that the second one will take 2 fractions. So we still have 4, because it's 1 plus 2 plus 1. But the second one takes the double size, 2/4, in other words, half of the space available. Okay? And we can do the same thing here, 3 out of 5, and so on. I could say 2 and 2, for example, as well, to build more advanced layout like that. So this is using fractions. If I change that, I can also use what I usually use in bricks to say, for example, repeat 3 times one fraction. And it does exactly the same, only that this time we have always the same size, always 1 FR in this case. We can also combine that with another method, for example, the MinMax. So we can say, for example, MinMax, it has a minimum of, let's say, 250 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction. So when we go below that number, below 250, then it will switch. That's why we had that little problem here, because now when I use a repeat function like that, it seems to create a bug here. But if I get rid of that number that Elementor has put for me, you see that I still have a minimum width of 250. And since, of course, I don't have enough space, that's why I have a scroll bar. If I didn't have a minimum, I would have 3 small squares for the columns. All right, so that's how grids are working with relative units or so on. And of course, I can play with that to say, for example, that the first one will be, I don't know, 400 pixels. And then the second one and the third one will be 1 fraction. Okay, well, maybe it's not enough here. So you see, now 800 is way too much, but just to show you that we can have a specific width for one, and the other two will divide the rest of the space in 2, in this case, because we have 1 fraction 2 times. So we can set a minimum width like that. So let's go back to the basic one. So using this technique, I could say, for example, 1 fraction, like I said, and 2 fractions, 1 fractions, to have the, what did I do here? Whoops, I forgot my R here. Okay. To have my second row, or second column, sorry, twice as wide as the first and the third one. So up to there, it's really working pretty good, and it's easy to use, especially if you know how to handle those more advanced units, if I can say it like that, here. But of course, you can use the gaps, by the way. So if I remove that and put, let's say, 2 rem. Oops, I need to switch, sorry, to rem here. So 2 rem. So you can have the amount of space that you want, and you can put that just for columns and rows, or you can put that just for columns. For example, whoops, forgot to unlock them. So here we go, just for columns, or of course the opposite, just for rows, if you uncheck the other one. So that's how it works on the grid level. Now, what about if I want to do more advanced layout? Let's say, for example, I want the first one and the first row to be like that, but the second row to have a smaller one, or 4 different ones. If I duplicate that one, for example, let's put 7 here. So is it possible to do so? Well, not really for now. As of today, anyway, with this new beta release, we cannot do that. So we are really limited on the first level of the grid, where we can decide whether it's a grid or not. Because if I go on the other level, for example, if I go to my 2 here, let's say get rid of that, and I specify, I don't know, 4 fractions, let's say, and you'll know why soon. And I want this one to be twice as big, so of course we will have only 3 elements anyway, because this one would be bigger. I would normally go to this container and specify that this one takes more space. But as you can see, we don't have any element here. We don't have any properties or that we can change to do that. No grid element at all. And if I switch from Flexbox to grid, that's another grid inside a grid. So that's not what I want at all. So there's no control right now, as of this beta release, on how to control the elements inside. Now, if I compare to what Brick is doing, I have done this demo in other videos, but just to show it to you. So we have the standard grid, okay, where we have my 6 elements with a fraction. If I show you how it's done. So I have my repeat 3 times 1 FR, sorry, to have my 3 columns. And I have one here that does something pretty similar to what we just saw in Elementor, where I have 1 fraction, 2 fraction, 1 fraction. So the second one is twice as big as the others, but still I put it as 3 columns. We have this one that is twice as big. So all of that can be done on the first level of the container, which have all my blocks inside of it. But if I want to do more advanced layout, like this one here, the one that I just mentioned, where we have the second column, and by the way, I changed the order here, that more details on that on the other video. Sorry. But you can see that on the first row, I have this one that takes twice the space, but I have 4 different columns here. So how do we do that? Well, on the main container, we set that we have a grid of 4, first of all. And sorry about that. And then at the level of the block itself here, the first one, because I moved it. So if I change the order, maybe it will be less confusing. Let's say I put this one back here like that. So I can directly on the block itself decide where it starts and where it ends. So let's say, to make it less confusing, I start at the first fraction, and this is the second fraction where I have this space here between the 2, and this is the third fraction. So if I go from 1 to 3, you see now that I can determine the size of it without having to do that on the top or change anything like that. So we have the grid columns and grid row. In other words, Bricks determines or knows that we are inside of a grid, so it gives us the properties for the grids, which is not the case with Elementor. So if I change that to 4 or to 5, you see, and like I can start at the second fraction and end at the third one or the fifth one, and so on. So I have way more control, and you see an example here where I have this one that takes in the entire space, and we have elements surrounding it. These are all things that we can do with bricks because we have those controls here. Now, officially, of course, if you know how to code in CSS, you could do that as well with Elementor. You would have to go inside the custom CSS and add the code for that. So let's say if I say selector, for example, to target the parent of that. And by the way, the code, I look at the code and it's much more cleaner. This one is just one div for the grid container and one grid for the container, one div, sorry, for the container, not a bunch of divs. Unfortunately, as soon as we add the heading, this one has 3 divs, which is useless, honestly. But the grid container here and this container are just 2 divs, 2 separate divs. So they're starting to improve a little bit. So anyway, if I have my grid columns here, and I set that to be, let's say 1, 3. So as you can see, it does pretty much the same thing as I had in bricks. I just need to manually do it. So 1, 3, 1, 4. And of course I could start at 2 instead, and so on. And same thing with the, if I say at 1, 3, I can have the grid row, and same thing, start at 1 and end at 3, let's say. So you see that we can do that, but we need to manually code it. So my guess is that it's because it's a beta version. I assume, based on previous release of Elementor, that it's going to be in beta for quite some time. And suddenly, at some point, they're going to add probably the ability for the children to be customized without having to go inside the CSS, the custom CSS. But anyway, it's still encouraging to see that it's coming to Elementor. Elementor, for a long time, they didn't have too much updates, and people were complaining about that. And suddenly, in the last few months, it has added a lot of things. Grid container came a few months ago. Then we have new things coming rapidly from time to with each iteration of new versions. So that's pretty encouraging to see that, but it's still a long way to go to be compared to other builders like, for example, bricks. So hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, put a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel so that you can see more videos like that. Thank you and have a good day.